Hi. It's great to be here. Thank you to everybody who made this possible. My name is Sheryl Ochayon, and I am going to actually pick up from Amy's last quote about Emanuel Ringelblum, and I'm going to be using a lot of his diary in this presentation because he wrote about the women that I am going to be talking about. And I'm going to tell you that in historical terms, we historians have a very technical term for these women. We call them badasses. So I hope you fall in love with them. I hope you fall in love with them the way I've fallen in love with them. I'll just say, because I do come from Echoes and Reflections, which is a program that teaches middle school and high school teachers how to teach the Holocaust all throughout the United States, I'll be using a lot of materials that we have on our website. Completely free program, by the way. Great work. So, here's Emanuel Ringelblum. You may remember this photo from last night's movie. And he says, the future historian will have to dedicate an appropriate page to the Jewish woman in the war. She will take up an important page in Jewish history for her courage and steadfastness. And I'm going to start there. This is a story of how armed resistance came to be. When we talk about things like the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising, or the uprisings, which many of you may not know, there were attempts at armed uprisings in 100 ghettos throughout Europe. That's a very, very little known story. When we talk about these uprisings, you cannot talk about them without talking about the women who made them possible. And I'm going to go out on a limb here, and I'm going to say that without these women, armed resistance in the ghettos would not have been possible. And so here's Emanuel Ringelblum, and we're going to get more into what he says about these women. So I'm going to give you some context first, because seeing the movie last night and understanding the misery and the tragedy, as Amy was pointing out, in these ghettos, this is directly related to what Ringelblum says. How did we allow this to happen? Why didn't we resist? Why did we go like sheep to the slaughter? So let me give you a little bit of context. This comes from the Echoes and Reflections website, and it is a movie that we did about, a very short movie, 15 minutes, about resistance. Just a couple of minutes.
When the German army invaded the Soviet Union and the Nazis began to systematically murder the Jews, youth movement couriers risked their lives to reach the isolated ghettos with this information. Most Jews did not believe the rumors. It was difficult to imagine such brutality. Yet, the leader of one of the youth groups in Vilna, Abba Kovner, instinctively understood that the Nazis intended to ruthlessly murder all the Jews of Europe. He called on the youth to take responsibility.
Jewish youth, do not trust those who are trying to deceive you. In front of our very eyes, they tore our parents, our brothers, our sisters from us. Hitler is plotting to annihilate all the Jews of Europe. Let us not go like sheep to the slaughter. The only response to the enemy is resistance. Brothers, it is better to die as free fighters than to live at the mercy of murderers. Resist to our last breath.
Why did Kovner turn specifically to the youth? The young men and women in the youth movements were teenagers. Like all teenagers, they believed they could change the world. Before the war, they saw themselves as educators and leaders taking responsibility for the future. In the ghettos, this idealism continued. They organized meetings, keeping up morale despite the grim reality of ghetto life. They assisted the community by caring for the children and creating soup kitchens. They also organized illegal activities, such as educational seminars and, importantly, underground newspapers. They believed in mankind. They still believed that they could fight the Germans and shape the future through education, morality, and spiritual weapons. Now, faced with mass murder that made the future an illusion, they understood that they would need more than spiritual weapons to fight the Germans. They were ready to die fighting for their ideals.
Kovner's pronouncement reached the Warsaw Ghetto, hundreds of miles to the east. Warsaw was the largest ghetto in Europe. At its height, over 450,000 Jews were trapped inside, desperately struggling to survive. Youth movements there hesitated at first, but as reports of extermination filtered in, they began to realize that it was only a matter of time before mass murder reached Warsaw.
So this is the bridge, okay? At what point do these youth movements realize if they're going to do something, they have to do something? This is the bridge from spiritual resistance, merely teaching the community and doing positive things in the community, and actually priming themselves for armed resistance. And this is where the role of women becomes a very, very critical role. So there's Abba Kovner's pronouncement. The women in the youth movements are going to play a very key role here. The youth groups are the ones who are going to come together. Why the youth movements? Again, like I said in the film, because they believed that they could change the world. They believed that they could do something about it. It's always the youth that believe we have the power, we can change things, we can make things right. So these youth movements get together, and part of the youth movements were the women who were in the youth movements. The philosophy here, which you can see, this is the youth movement in Krakow, the Akiba youth movement in Krakow. From our road, there is no turning back. We are fighting for 3 lines in history, if only to show that Jewish youth did not go like sheep to the slaughter. So there you have a direct connection to what Amy was talking about, and also what Abba Kovner says in his manifesto. This is the resistance. This is going to be the resistance. But of course, in the ghettos, there are going to be a lot of obstacles. The first obstacle is going to be, sorry, that's also from the website. The first obstacle is going to be isolation. How, if you have this notion that you have to resist, how will you spread that notion to other ghettos when your ghetto is cut off from the world? And that was something that the Germans did purposely. So they cut off these ghettos, and you need a way to get this ideology, to spread this notion that we have to resist. Of course, you have mass starvation and death, which makes things very, very difficult because people are really only thinking about where their next meal is going to come from. They're not thinking about fighting back. Just some more overcrowding and demoralization. All of these things made resistance very, very difficult. And here you just to kind of give you a visual how far this resistance, this idea of resisting, needed to travel geographically. So how are you going to do this? Of course, you also have these other problems. Lack of weapons, that's a big problem, which we'll talk about. Caring for parents. These youth movements found themselves caring for older parents. Family members, the danger of collective punishment, and denying the threat of death instead of facing it, because most people don't want to believe that their end is in sight. So you have all of these things that are going to prevent physical resistance. Travis, can I get you to cue this one up for me? This comes from the Eichmann trial, and this is Rivka Lipskin-Cooper, who was actually married to the man who was the spearhead of the resistance in Krakow. And she was a survivor of Auschwitz as well. And she talks about what the first step is.
Very early learned after the first deportations, we heard rumors about the direction of those deportation trains. And then we came to a decision that we cannot go and be slaughtered like sheep. We cannot stand with folded arms and look on as our parents or children, brothers and sisters, were taken away from us and not do anything about it. Of course, it is easy to relate now, but it was very difficult at the time. The first thing we did, after we learned the aim of those deportations, were to send warnings to all Jews. Our girls who had any way or means by their Aryan look to leave the ghetto would go out of the ghetto, get in touch with other ghettos. I did that as well. We used to come to ghettos and get in touch with the people we know The danger was great. It was dangerous during the war to approach a stranger, but through those acquaintances, we sent word to everybody. We sent word where those deportation trains headed for.
So you hear her talking, first of all, you hear this whole notion of sheep to the slaughter. That's come up quite a few times already. But what you hear her saying is, we sent out our girls. Who were our girls? Who are these women that she's talking about? So our girls are the couriers. It comes from the idea, it's a little difficult to see there in the middle, but it comes from the idea, the word couriers is kind of a second, it's not as good as the Hebrew word, which is kashariot. The kashariot were the people who connected from the word kesher, which means connection. And these were people, they were the women who were a lifeline between these ghettos. So they're going to fulfill a lot of different functions that will become very important in getting this engine of armed resistance started. This is the false ID of Vladka Mead. I'm sure many of you have heard of Vladka. She appears a lot in the Echoes and Reflections curriculum, and this is her false ID. These were women, and you'll see this here. They had the look. They were able to fool the Nazis, sometimes not the Poles, but many times the Nazis. And this is, again, Emanuel Ringelblum. These heroic girls, Chaika and Frumka, they are a theme that calls for the pen of a great writer. Boldly, they travel back and forth through the cities and towns of Poland. They are in mortal danger every day. They rely entirely on their Aryan faces and on the peasant kerchiefs that cover their heads. Without a murmur, without a moment of hesitation, they accept and carry out the most dangerous missions. Is someone needed to Vilna, Bialystok, Lemberg, Kovel, Lublin, Częstochowa, or Radom to smuggle in contraband, such as illegal publications, goods, money? The girls volunteer as though it were the most natural thing in the world. They undertake the mission. Nothing stands in their way. Nothing deters them. How many times have they looked death in the eyes? How many times have they been arrested and searched? So here you get an idea of the badass quality of these women. They were brave. They were brave, and they were going to do whatever it took to get things done. So who were the couriers? This is a great photo. You see Tema Schneiderman, Lonka Kuzhibrodska, Bela Khazan, and there were many others. But this just gives you a sense, and we're going to go through what their functions were, what happens to these women at the end. I'm going to keep you in suspense. So they're always active in these youth movements. They're ideologically committed. They are going to fight for what they believe in. For many of them, the group is going to be like a surrogate family, especially after their own parents or siblings are killed or taken away by the Nazis. They are coming together as a group all the time with a lot of passion, with a lot of pride, and they're going to do whatever it takes. They had Aryan looks. So it's the peasant kerchief, and even those who don't have Aryan looks, like Frumka Plotnitska, who did not have Aryan looks, she radiated calm. That's what they say about her. She was able to pull it off because she could just be so she had it together. But most of the time, these are women who not only have the looks, they speak the native language, and they speak without an accent. And why is that? This is very interesting, because usually the children who were male children were educated in Yiddish, in cheder, in yeshivas, and it's the women who are educated in the public schools. So they pick up the language, they pick up the accent, they pick up the mannerisms, and so they know how to speak like a native. They don't give themselves away, and that's very important. Most of them are going to be in their late teens and early 20s. They had chutzpah. Chutzpah is very important here. You got to have the chutzpah, and they were very cool under pressure. Many times they inspired men to be chivalrous. If they were carrying bags of guns or periodicals or printed material that needed to be spread, a lot of times if they would get on a train and they were always crossing borders, they would actually ask the men. They would ask Nazi officials to carry, excuse me, these bags are so heavy, can you imagine? Okay, so they knew how to inspire men to be chivalrous. They had the physical and sociological advantages, and what do we mean by that? Listen, women know how to flirt, women know how to use this to an advantage, but the biggest advantage that they had is that they were not circumcised. Jewish men have a telltale physical scar, but the women did not have that problem. So, and it's not just the circumcision itself, it's also the psychological value. They already had the confidence that they couldn't be found out just from what they looked like. So that gave them the confidence to go on. And very attuned to nonverbal cues. For instance, if someone looks at you too long on the street and you drop your eyes, you're done. They got those cues, these nonverbal cues. They had the intuition. So these are why the women made such great couriers. Now, there are a lot of functions. First of all, they're going to relieve isolation between the ghettos. They're going to connect. I mean, you can see this is self-explanatory. All of these things that they're going to do, procure forged documents and get them from one ghetto to another. They smuggled a lot of Jews out of the ghettos. They smuggled out children. One of the things that Vlad Kami did a lot, and it was very important, was smuggling children out of the ghettos if they had a place to hide them. They distributed food and medicine and money. They encouraged armed resistance, disseminated secret information, newspapers. Now, the obtaining and distributing weapons and guns is probably the most important thing that they did in the general scheme of things, which we'll get to. They connected to the partisans. So all of these things were what these women were accomplishing. It's a whole lot. This is Chafka Fulman Rabban, who was a courier and lived to tell the tale. She says, one of the most difficult concerns that filled the heart of Jews was the feeling that the entire world had forgotten about us, that we had no hope and certainly no future. This was loneliness in all its horror. With meager abilities, we young women worked to ease this feeling of loneliness so that it would be less suffocation. We let them know in the ghettos that they could depend on contact and activity, and that was very important because they really did feel cut off. Tosia Altman was another courier. And this was written by Roshka Korchak from the Vilna ghetto. Tosia came. It was like a blessing of freedom. Just the information that she came, it spread among the people as if there were no ghetto, as if there were no death around, as if we were not in this terrible war. A beam of love, a beam of light. So you see the impact that these women had just by reaching these isolated ghettos. But they did a lot more than that, of course. This is Lanka Kuchibrodska again. Her arrival in the ghettos was a holiday for the members of the movement. They surrounded her in awe, and she told them about Jewish youth unwilling to accept the humiliation imposed upon them, Jewish youth who dreamed of a better life or even of a more noble death. And of course, one of the things that they do is, one of the very important things is they disseminate this information about mass murder that no one wanted to believe. So Chafka again says that she carried on her body the makings of history. This was also a very, very important function. And she knew immediately after she left, the members of the group would read the entire collection, it would give them strength, and they would begin searching for a more dynamic way to go on. Again, Lanka, her friends used to say that Lanka wouldn't burn even in a fire. That's how cool she was, okay? So these were women who really, they looked death in the eye all the time because they were constantly being stopped, they were constantly being searched. They were eyewitnesses to annihilation. You take a look at a map like this and you understand how many borders they crossed, how many trips they made, and each one of these trips could have spelled death for them. But it was important to get that information out. It was important to do what they could do for the movement. Frumka Plotnitska, she witnessed the annihilation of so many communities that she started to call herself the grave digger of the Jewish people. These are all pictures from Brubieshov. And this is a very, very long quote. I'm going to just give you the gist of it because it is so long. These were women who witnessed what was going on at the train stations. They witnessed the Germans separating the Jews. They witnessed the Germans forcing Jews to dig their own graves. And this is what they see. The woman who tries to throw her baby over a fence and the baby is shot. The silence that descends on the platform. You know, I hold fast to the windowsill. I feel terribly dizzy. Think about the toll that this took on these women. This was a very difficult function that they were performing. And all the time they need to smile because they're not Jews. and they are pretending to be Aryan. So we are allowed to look our fill, only a trifle is required of us, a smiling face. Are we not supposed to be true Goyim, non-Jews? And is not spring in the air? And she hears that that all of the Jewish youth has been concentrated in the back of the town. They're intended for labor camps, while the rubbish will go elsewhere to the death camps. This remark by my informant is accompanied by a sly smile, which I have to return in kind. The next morning, the train stands on the platform, and, this is what they see, is the remnants, what's left behind after all these Jews are taken to their deaths. So this is what these women are seeing. This is what they have to deal with all the time. And they have to encounter this denial, which maybe is the most difficult thing. So Hafka says after this trip to Hrubievshov, we returned to Warsaw, described what we had seen. To our friends, this was the first reliable information about the deportation of Jews from Eastern Poland for extermination. I felt like they did not want to believe us. That was the first and last time during the course of the war that I cried. I was so stressed I could no longer take the tension. I also told my parents what I had seen. I remember my father's eyes. He refused to believe it. It's impossible, he insisted, because this is the great denial. How could it be that Warsaw, the big metropolis, the biggest Jewish population in all of Europe, is about to be wiped out? No one can believe it. So in order to get armed resistance, in order to carry out armed resistance, there have to be weapons, because there were no weapons in the ghetto. These women are going to be the ones, and sometimes in bags, in baskets of potatoes, they are going to be the ones who smuggle the guns, the first guns, into the weapons. You can see, into the ghettos. You can see what Vladka says. This was the mission for which they hid like frightened animals, to obtain arms for resistance. And the unbelievable thing here is that when these ghettos decided to resist the Germans, they had no weapons. And we're talking about no weapons. In Bialystok, 1 rifle, 1 revolver. In Vilna, 2 in Warsaw. Not a single gun in Krakow. The way the underground in Krakow, the way they trained for armed resistance was by picking up a stick and going bang, bang. And that's what they had to deal with. There were absolutely no guns. So that was also a very important function of these women. And sometimes you had to travel 800 kilometers for 5 guns. How can I describe the joy of our whole group, the trembling hands that freed the weapon of its string and paper and took hold of the cold steel and looked at it with shining eyes? Can I describe Gedaliahu's trembling with joy, with the delight of the future battle to which we would no longer go empty-handed? Think how important these women were in this whole issue of battle. Bronko Klibanski, who hid weapons inside loaves of bread. Hella, who strapped the weapons to her body, and one of the funniest stories, funny not funny stories, is that they were always afraid when they traveled on public transportation. Many times they traveled with grenades in their underwear. And one of their biggest fears was that some chivalrous man would offer them his seat. Then what do you do? Okay, so this was also a big deal. This is Vladka again, and one of the things, this testimony comes from USC Shoah Foundation, where Vladka describes actually smuggling the map of Treblinka out of the ghetto to the other side, to the Aryan side. So this was, the first awareness of death camps. And she does talk about it. We won't play the courier. The difficulties of being a courier, the biggest difficulty is fear. Because remember, these women are playing, it's like they're actresses playing a role, but if they are discovered, it really means death for them, usually. So the common denominator is fear of the Germans, fear of the Poles, fear of the blackmailers, fear of losing one's hideout, fear of being left penniless. It was a constant companion, even if you had the right look, you had to have Polish customs and habits. Many of these women, remember that these women are living on the Aryan side. They're not living in the ghettos. They're not living with the Jews. And if they're living in an apartment by themselves, that's also going to cause a lot of suspicion, because you're talking about a period of time where young women don't live by themselves. So they have to invite friends over. They have to have Christmas parties. They have to make it seem to their landlords, who are the first ones to get suspicious, that everything is normal. And it's always the eyes. The eyes were thought to give them away. The mute look of melancholy, the haunted look of fear. Your eyes give you away, our friends would tell us. Make them look livelier, merrier. You won't attract so much attention. But our eyes kept constantly watching, searching the shadows, glancing behind, seeing our own misfortune and foreseeing even worse to come. Haunted by fear of betrayal, our eyes betrayed us, and this knowledge only increased our fear. The way these women wrote also, absolutely, absolutely beautiful. This is Adina Blady-Schweiger, who would take currency from place to place to support people who were living on the other side, living on the Aryan side. And she talks about the fear. She was blanketed with banknotes, and by the time she got to where she was going, the banknotes were soaked in sweat. So you imagine this fear was tangible fear. There's so much left to tell you. This is one of the great quotes. This is Gusta Justina Davidson-Dranger from the Krakow ghetto, and she has an incredible book that is available. It's called Justina's Narrative. It's amazing. She wrote this on pieces of toilet paper from her cell in prison after she was arrested, and that's a story that needs to be made into a movie. Again, another movie. How do you manage to sneak out of a ring of barbed wire surrounded and closely guarded by police? How do you take your first step into the outside world? They'll see the armband on your sleeve. Perhaps you should try to slip into the blackness of the darkest doorway and there undertake to remove the ornament adorning your arm. No matter how dark that doorway, there will always be someone who notices that you stepped into it a Jew and stepped out as if you were a human being. Why as if you were a human being? Because to take off the armband successfully, you first have to regain your sense of human dignity. Without that, you're nothing more than a Jew without an armband. It's a very profound thing that she's talking about here. You would reveal your Jewishness in 1,000 small ways, every anxiety-filled move, every step taken with a back hunched over from the yoke of slavery, every glance that bespoke the terror of a hunted animal, the entire form, the face on which the ghetto had left its indelible mark. You're nothing more than a Jew because of the color of your eyes, hair, skin, the shape of your nose. You're unmistakably a Jew because of your lack of self-assurance, your way of expressing yourself, your behavior. You're simply and conspicuously a Jew because everybody outside the ghetto strained to detect your Jewishness. All those people eager to do you harm who couldn't abide the thought that you might be cheating death. This is what these women were up against. And the fact that many of them managed to complete their missions is really, it's just an unbelievable testament to them. Of course, they were also lonely because they're living outside the ghetto. So what happens to these women? It's forbidden for them to be traveling around on trains, to be out of ghettos. They have to worry about the blackmailers. They have to worry about being turned in constantly. And remember also that as they're traveling on these trains, they're hearing people say things like, "It's about time those Jews got it. Oh, those Jews are frying. They've got what's coming to them." And there they are sitting like wounded animals. A human being who has not recovered from the loss of those dearest to him, and yet he dare not let a single muscle on his face so much as twitch. So that's what these women have to put up with. Of course, they have to leave their families, and I'm going to get to their fate now if they're captured. You have Tema on the upper left-hand side of the screen. Tema was actually killed in the January 1943, what we call the Little Warsaw Ghetto Uprising. She was killed. Lanka Kuzibrodska, you can see this is her picture from Auschwitz. She was captured as a Polish woman. If she had been captured as a Jew, without her false papers, there's no way she would have survived for as long as she did, but she was captured as a Pole. You can tell that from her uniform, by the triangle on her uniform. And she managed to survive for 3 months at Auschwitz, and ultimately she died in the arms of Bela Chazan, who was also captured and sent to Auschwitz. Chavka, who we've spoken about, also was sent to Auschwitz, but Chavka managed to live to tell the story, as did Bela. So this is the fate, and I'm going to wrap up now kind of with a testament from other sources. This is Antek Zuckerman, who was the second in command to Mordechai Anilevich, who was basically the head of Eyal, one of the resistance groups in the Warsaw Ghetto, the ZOB. And he says, the girls were invaluable, their sacrifice was infinite. Without them, it would have definitely have been impossible to maintain the movement throughout the German occupation zone. All of them, and every individual according to her ability, risked her life and demonstrated unimaginable loyalty. I asked myself where they drew their strength, what sustained them. And we get maybe a little bit of an answer from Liza Chapnik, who was a career in Bialystok. She says, I should say that each step of the Jewish women on the Aryan side was extremely risky and dangerous. We seemed to have lived on the verge of disaster, to have walked on the edge of a blade. We all assumed that none of us would survive, but it was our moral duty to fight the Nazis, to avenge our parents and our people. And this is Sivya Lubetkin, who also was very much involved in the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising and was also a courier. There wasn't much hope, but people believed in what they were doing. Young people together somehow are not afraid. It was absolutely clear to us that if we did nothing, the entire Jewish community of Poland would have been murdered without having uttered a cry of protest. This realization gave us strength to not simply kill ourselves in despair. I'm going to skip this testimony. This is also from the Eichmann trial. This is a poem written by Hannah Senesh, not the same set of circumstances, but let's end with Emanuel Ringelblum, since he's who we started with. The story of the Jewish women will be a glorious page in the history of Jewry during the present war, and the Chaikas and the Frumkas will be the leading figures in this story, for these girls are indefatigable. Thank you very much.